Right, thank you for your patience. We will now begin the webinar. I would like to provide a few logistical notes before we transition into the main presentation. Participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions or if you experience any technical difficulties, please type into the chat window, which is indicated as such on the screen here. We will have a moderated question and answer session towards the end of the session, so please type your questions for the speakers and panelists into the same chat window, and they will be read aloud and answered as time allows. This webinar is being recorded, and within a week's time, we will be posting the recording to our YouTube channel and the website. Please also note that we've provided some handouts that complement today's discussion, and you may download them off the handout section on your dashboard. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. So good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. My name is Kavanaugh Livingston, and I'm a Senior Program Associate at the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. The Alliance is very pleased to collaborate with our partners, Inyenyeri and the International Center for Research on Women, or ICRW, to present on results and outcomes of ICRW's recent assessment of an Inyenyeri project to introduce biomass fuel pellets and Mimimoto stoves into the Kigeme refugee camp in Rwanda. This webinar was especially designed for partners who are interested in learning more about cooking in humanitarian settings and how cash programming may be used to support market-based interventions. So during the session, my colleague Kathleen Callahy, Senior Program Associate for the Alliance's Humanitarian Program, will provide an overview of the program and a little bit as to how the project components came together. Ali Galinsky, Senior Gender and Evaluation Specialist at ICRW, will present on the assessment of the project's impact and on the refugees' lives and livelihoods, particularly examining factors such as time use, fuel procurement, expenditure, safety, and quality of life. She will discuss numerous findings on the social benefits of the pilot and some of the broader implications and challenges that resulted from the work. And our colleague Susie Huber, Inyenyeri's legal and policy advisor, will discuss the impact of ICRW's assessment on their current efforts to scale up their operations in Kigeme. So thank you for your attention. Without further delay, I would like to hand over the reins to Kathleen. Kathleen, take it away.
Thank you, Kavanaugh. Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really exciting to have a chance to get to present on this project, which, despite being a relatively small project, has taken a lot of time and work, so we're happy to present it. Briefly, I just want to give an overview of the Alliance's work in humanitarian settings. Not everyone is aware that we do this, but 134 million people worldwide are in need of humanitarian assistance, and that's as a result of forced displacement due to conflict and violence, being affected by natural disasters, and internally displaced for any number of reasons. The data that we have is limited on this, but it does suggest that the majority of displaced people are cooking with firewood or biomass fuels. What you see on the screen is a recent aggregation of data from UNHCR and the Moving Energy Initiative on the Humanitarian Data Exchange, showing that 85% of displaced people who live in camps are largely cooking with firewood or a firewood charcoal mix. This is just based on camp settings. The majority of displaced people are outside of camp settings, but again, we suspect that this is the case for most displaced people. Most of the food that is given by humanitarian agencies in these settings needs to be cooked, dry goods like beans and rice and so on. But refugees are largely not provided with the fuel to cook the fuel or ability to cook them, which is a huge oversight. Part of the reason for this is because energy is sort of missing as a key area in humanitarian assistance. What you see on the screen now is the humanitarian cluster system, which is the way that the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the UN organizes assistance for non-refugee scenarios. And here you see that we have special areas for water sanitation, shelter, protection, logistics, health, food security, and so on. However, none of these, there's no energy component in this matrix, and there is no environment component. So around the edges, I've tried to show where cooking, powering, heating, and lighting come in to these areas. And as you can see, it's a highly cross-cutting subject. What this means is that there is no formal role for dedicated for energy, which means no long-term strategies, no funding, and no quality standards. And that leads to a lot of duplication of aid and wasted resources. Basically, it's up to humanitarian agencies on their own if they want to incorporate energy into their work. So the Alliance's humanitarian program is trying to fill some of this gap. We currently co-chair the Safe Access to Fuel and Energy Humanitarian Working Group, which coordinates what energy aid there is in humanitarian settings. It goes into who is doing what where on energy access. We do a lot of advocacy, trying to mainstream energy access and clean cooking into humanitarian assistance. We do research to build the evidence base for the fact that humanitarian cooking interventions can be effective, as well as for other topics like the connection between firewood collection and gender-based violence. We've provided technical assistance in the past to organizations such as UNHCR by developing safe strategies for them, both at the global level and the national level for various countries. And we've also developed cook stove procurement standards for UNHCR. One of our biggest program components is capacity building. The Alliance hosts annual Safe Access to Fuel and Energy training workshops, which are designed to help humanitarian practitioners learn how to incorporate energy and cooking into their current programming. And lastly, we do resource mobilization. Last year, we launched our Humanitarian Clean Cooking Fund for the first time, which I'll go into a little bit later. A lot of things have to come together for a project like this one to work. So I'm just going to quickly take you through that. For all intents and purposes, it started in July 2015 when Inyenyeri and a representative from UNHCR Rwanda met at our 2015 SAFE workshop, which was hosted by the Alliance under our funding from the UK Department for International Development. I've put all the donors' names in purple here just to sort of make it clear how many different funding streams came into this. Later that year, the Alliance received funding from the Finland Ministry for Foreign Affairs to do fuels research in Rwanda. So then there's a bit of a gap after that, and in 2016, the Alliance received a grant from, so the Alliance just contracted with the International Center for Research on Women to do the pilot assessment, the report that we're talking about today, under the Finland grant. In September, Inyenyeri and UNHCR launched their project in Kigeme, funded by BPRM Safe from the Start initiative. Sorry, there should be a B there. And lastly, in October, the Alliance published the Social Impact Measurement System, which Ali will be explaining later in the presentation. It's essentially the monitoring and evaluation framework that ICRW used to do this assessment. And this had been in development from early 2015 and also funded by UK DFID. Then we go to 2017. In March, ICRW completed its data analysis for Kigeme, and we shared the results with Inyenyeri. In June, the Alliance finally launched our Humanitarian Clean Cooking Fund with support from the Norwegian Development Organization, or NORAD. And Inyenyeri applied as one of the applicants to scale up their work in Kigeme. In October, Inyenyeri received funding from the IKEA Foundation to scale up work in Kigeme. Sorry, this is a little bit out of order. Around December, UNHCR received funding from the Belgian government to fund refugee cash transfers in Kigeme, which would allow them to purchase fuel. And not long before that, the Alliance awarded Inyenyeri a grant for Kigeme Scale Up, in addition to the IKEA funds, also supported by NORAD. So as you can see, there's a lot of processes that went into this, and we're excited to share some of the results. Just a reminder, we're going to be having a moderated Q&A at the end of the session, but for now, I'm going to be handing it over to Susie Huber, who's just going to give us a quick overview of the pilot project in Kigeme. So Susie, we can see your screen. Are you speaking?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It seems as though my screen is paused, though. That's what I'm seeing.
That it's just not coming through? Okay. Let me try taking it back and giving it to you again. Okay. And if that doesn't work, I'll just go through your presentation. You can tell me when to click.
Okay. Is it coming up?
Getting black. All right. Okay, then I'll just view your presentation and you can just tell me when to click through.
Okay.
Apologies, everyone. There's always some technical difficulties to sort out with these things. Okay, Susie, so just tell me to click through when you're ready.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. My name is Susanna Huber, and I am the Refugee Program Manager at Inyenyeri. I have been working on this project since 2015, so I was actually the one who went to the SAFE workshop that Kathleen just showed in the timeline, so I've been with it from the beginning. I will start with a brief introduction to Inyenyeri and our business model. I will then explain how we adapted the model to pilot our services inside a refugee camp in Rwanda. Inyenyeri is a cooking fuel company based in Rwanda. We deliver the world's cleanest biomass-fueled cook stoves to the world's poorest households through a for-profit model. Next screen, please. So this is how our business model works in Gisenyi, which is where we are headquartered. We have what we call two different kinds of customers. We have customers who are used to collecting firewood and so do not normally spend cash on purchasing fuel. And we've created a barter system with them where they provide us the firewood that they would normally cook with, and we use that as feedstock to create our pellets. And we have so we call those our barter customers, and they're usually located in rural areas, and so we refer to them as rural customers. You'll see them on the left-hand side of this slide. On the other hand, we have customers who are used to buying charcoal, so they have cash to spend on fuel, and we sell them the pellets that we produce with the crowdsourced biomass from our rural customers. Usually these customers are in urban areas, and so we refer to them as urban customers. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about the business model for Inyenyeri, but very briefly, this is how we've kind of divided our two customers. And so I wanted to explain this to you to understand what context we were thinking of. Because Inyenyeri is a social enterprise, we have a social mission, which is to serve the most vulnerable households in Rwanda. And one very big group of vulnerable households in Rwanda are refugees. Next slide, please. In order for us to understand how we could serve the refugee population using a market-based approach, we had to understand the context of cooking in refugee camps in Rwanda. So what I'm going to present now is the context of cooking in Rwanda in 2016, which is when we started discussions with UNHCR and how we could bring Inyenyeri into the camps. The situation inside the refugee camps at that time was that there was in-kind firewood distribution by UNHCR, but it did not meet the full cooking needs of refugees. Refugees at that time received 0.8 kilos per person per day to cook with, which met around 25% of their cooking needs. So this told us that if they were only receiving 25% of their cooking needs, they must have been meeting their cooking needs in other ways. However, it was illegal for or it still is, illegal for refugees to go outside the camp to collect firewood. Also, when we went to go visit different camps, we did see that there were charcoal sellers inside the camp. So we started asking people at the sites where they were selling charcoal inside the camp how much they were purchasing, how much they were selling it for, etc. So this gave us an understanding of a rough estimate of how much refugees were probably spending in order to meet their cooking needs that they didn't get from the in-kind firewood distribution. At that time, there were, I believe, 3 camps that had been switched from food donations from World Food Program to cash transfers. And the cash transfers amounted to around $7.80 per person per month in order to meet their food needs. Next slide, please. So knowing that some camps had cash, we decided to go obviously to a camp that was already receiving cash transfers from World Food Program, because we knew that if we wanted to do a market-based approach, that the refugees would have to be able to at least access cash on a monthly basis. Therefore, we decided to go to Kigeme camp, which was one of the first camps in Rwanda to receive such cash transfers. And together with UNHCR, we launched the pilot in October 2016. Inyenyeri was the first private sector company to open a shop inside a refugee camp in Rwanda. We also trained and hired 4 refugees as customer service representatives to help us train our customers in the use of the fuel and stove and to run the shop. Next slide, please. So the pilot was only going to consist of 100 households. So we had an event where we randomly selected 120 households from the camp, and we invited them to a stove demonstration event. At this event, which is what these photos are of, we explained to them what signing up to Inyenyeri meant. And Inyenyeri sells subscriptions, which means that in exchange for the free use of the Mimimoto stove, we expect refugees to pay a minimum of 2,000 Rwandan francs, or $2.50 per month, for the use of the stove and 10 kilos of pellets. Now, we made it 10 kilos just to make, because we knew that 10 kilos of pellets was not going to meet all of their cooking needs, but because at that time they were still receiving free firewood distribution, they already had 25% of their cooking fuel needs being met. We made the package a little bit, we made it much smaller so that we also had a lower barrier to signing up to become Inyenyeri customers. According to our estimates, an average household of 5 persons inside the camp would need 30 kilos of pellets per month to cook exclusively with Inyenyeri. So that would be 1 meal a day, which is what on average most refugee households do. So it was very clear that the 10 kilos was not going to meet all of their cooking needs. So the results of the pilots were, after 3 months, that 83% of the households continued to purchase pellets, which means that we had quite a high customer retention rate. The 17% who did not continue after 3 months cited inability to pay as the main reason for why they decided to stop being Inyenyeri clients. The average monthly purchase was 10.16 kilos. So 10 kilos was the minimum amount, which means that they were not purchasing much more above the minimum amount to keep being Inyenyeri customers. After 6 months, we had a customer retention rate of 58%. So the key takeaway for us of the pilot was that refugees were willing to pay for Inyenyeri's cooking solution, but were not able to pay for more than the current minimum of 10 kilos of pellets per month. And this is where the ICRW evaluation goes into play. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you, Susie, for setting the stage for us. That's really helpful. We're going to hand it over now to Ali Glinsky from ICRW. Ali, given the technical difficulties we're having, I'm just going to open up your presentation and click through if that works for you. Ali, do we still have you? It's possible you are muted. If
oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for that great overview, both Kathleen and Susie. Great to hear kind of the overview of the project. First, before I even get into kind of what we did in our findings, I just wanted to provide a little overview about ICRW, which is the International Center for Research on Women. So you can go to the next slide. Our mission is to empower women, advance gender equality, and fight poverty throughout the developing world. And ICRW builds evidence base through its research on the most pressing issues that women and girls face, such as economic empowerment, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, men and masculinities. And we always work through local, national, and international partners to conduct research, build capacity, and advocate for evidence-based solutions. ICRW recognizes how women's access to and participation in clean energy initiatives contributes to more gender equitable development. And as women are frequently involved in energy collection, cultivation, and use, they have the power to catalyze energy markets. And so while a lot of work has been done to measure environmental and health impacts of clean cook stoves and fuels, less is known about the social impacts that result from the clean cooking sector. And so due to our interest in these social impacts, and particularly how clean cook stoves and fuels contribute to women's empowerment, ICRW and the Alliance have been working together over the past several years to create a global social impact measurement system to measure the social impacts associated with clean cooking. We can click to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit of an overview of this system first, and then I'll go into the findings from how we use this measurement system to conduct a social impact assessment with Inyenyeri. So first, why create this system? The goals are threefold. So one, so that clean cooking implementers, researchers, and investors are all in alignment about how to define and measure the social impacts of the clean cooking sector. Two, so that clean cooking implementers have clear guidance on how to collect and use social impact data and can use this information to monitor their own progress, improve their business models, and also to attract additional funding. And three, so that the clean cooking sector can aggregate its social impacts at the global level. And this information can be used to drive more investment to the field and kind of new and different investors as well. And so here is the kind of overview of what the social impact measurement system is. We have kind of a how-to guide, then a list of social impact indicators, adaptable survey tools, and kind of guidance around how to use it. These are all links on the Alliance website, so you can go there and download any of these tools. And just wanted to provide this overview so that when you see the findings I'm presenting from the Inyenyeri assessment, you can see that you could use these tools to get similar data from your own organization as well. Next slide. So the social impact measurement system consists of measurement at three levels: organizational, employee, entrepreneur, and user level. Next slide. At the organizational level, you're kind of conducting it once a year, summarizing social impacts of the organization's model, operations, support the social impact assessment requirements of donors and investors. You're collecting things like employee information, training, ownership, etc. At the employee entrepreneur level, you'd conduct this survey with employees and entrepreneurs soon after they start with your organization, and then about 6 months to a year later. And this is measuring things like livelihoods, access to and use of financial services and credit, access to and participation in networks, empowerment, agency, training, mentoring, and business autonomy and efficacy. And then finally, the user level, similarly, would be conducted among users soon after they purchase your cook stove or fuel, and then again about 3 to 6 months later, so that you can measure any change that occurred associated with the use of that cook stove or fuel. And it measures things like household economic stability, usage or adoption of the cook stove or fuel, cooking dynamics, health and safety, fuel expenditure, drudgery status, customer satisfaction. And this is the survey I'll be kind of focusing more on today when talking about the work we did with Inyenyeri. So as both Kathleen and Susie mentioned, in 2017, with support from the Alliance, ICRW worked with Inyenyeri to conduct a social impact assessment of their Mimimoto distribution initiative or distribution pilot in Kigeme camp. And as this was a pilot project, we wanted to know kind of what is working well and what could be adjusted as Inyenyeri scales the model in the future, and which they're doing now. And Susie will even talk after I'm done about how they've been able to use some of this information as they scale. And this image here and link at the bottom are the social impact assessment report. So if you want to check out more, you can go there. So the methods with the customers, we did 4 focus group discussions, and then the quantitative social impact assessment survey. Here we did with 50 intervention households, those that were participating, and 50 comparison households. And we did it at one kind of baseline point in time, right after they got the stove, and then 3 months later. And you'll see, I'll talk a little bit, but doing it with the intervention and comparison household really enabled us to understand which changes were due to Inyenyeri and which changes were due to other external forces, such as different season. The baseline was conducted in dry season and the end line in rainy season. So as most of you probably know, there's a lot of dynamics that will shift related to fuel use and collection and time, just with that seasonality. We also conducted 4 in-depth interviews with Inyenyeri employees, and we did one key informant interview with a health worker to try and kind of explore some of the health impacts a little bit more. So this slide just shows us all the different areas of impact collected by that user survey, and I've just circled all the ones that I'm going to talk about today. So almost all of them, but we'll kind of go through some of them quickly. So this first graph is a picture of kind of adoption, showing which stoves were used. And so the way we did this is we looked at, if you look at the bottom of the graph, there's 5 cooking tasks. So cooking porridge, rice, beans, ugali, and potatoes. And then we asked which stoves were used at baseline and then which stoves were used at endline. And this gives us the idea, we know that stove stacking is going on in all the time, but which stoves are being used. And we can see that at the end line, so this is just among those intervention households, the Mimimoto was the primary device used for all cooking tasks except for beans. I'll get into that a little bit more. The Mimimoto is the red. So you see kind of at baseline, of course, it isn't used, and then at end line, there's a lot of red in these bars, primarily replacing the 3-stone fire. But we see that even at end line, 3-stone fire, fixed mud, and traditional stoves are still being used. This next graph shows us changes in cooking time. And so here we see that there was overall a 45% decrease in cooking time among Inyenyeri users. And again, we go kind of for each of these cooking tasks, and you can see large decreases associated with porridge, rice, ugali, and potatoes. But this does highlight this unique case of beans. And so we see that in general, the time to cook beans is much longer than other foods. And there was actually a kind of increase in the time associated with cooking beans overall. Even when we look at just using the Mimimoto, we see that the reduction is quite small. And this told us that, one, people aren't frequently using the Mimimoto for cooking beans because it takes such a long time no matter what, and they don't want to use up all of their pellets on the beans. And also, even when households use the Mimimoto to cook beans, it's not really reducing their cooking time. So, this is an interesting insight that if beans are really an important staple in Rwandans' diets, Inyenyeri might want to consider, is there shifts to the stove design, teaching, what would be some tweaks that would enable people to use the pellets to cook the beans, or maybe we just advise that they don't use the Mimimoto at all for cooking the beans. And just overall, if we take beans out, just knowing that it's a bit of an outlier, we see that at the baseline, households were spending about 285 minutes a week on cooking, and at endline, only 40 minutes. So there's just a huge decrease in the amount of time if we take that outlier of beans out. Next slide. So in addition to just understanding whether or not the time decreased, we wanted to know how were people using that saved time. So 100% of Inyenyeri customers reported the perception that it took less time to cook now. And we followed that question up with, okay, and so how are you using this saved time? And we see that the most frequently reported tasks are cleaning the house and childcare. There's a quote, I used to spend much time and energy on cooking, but now I have time to breathe. I also have time to visit with friends. So while this is great that they're saving time and shifting, it also kind of highlights just the overall picture of women's time poverty, that even when this cooking time is reduced, that time ends up shifting to other household tasks. So it's not necessarily that they have all this time for leisure or income generation, but they just have so many tasks that it just shifts from one to another. Here we wanted to look at whether there was a change in who was involved in cooking. Knowing that the Mimimoto is so much easier to use, we were hoping that we might see a shift from the women being the ones to men actually also helping out. However, we did not see that shift at all. It stayed the same. Still women and girls at baseline and end line, a little bit more of house help at the end line. And a quote that kind of captures this dynamic is one woman said, "In our culture, when a woman is there, the man cannot cook." So, just a reminder that just this clean cooking technology isn't enough to shift these types of social norms. Next is drudgery. So this is the level of effort associated with cooking, and we see a 72% decrease in the overall level of drudgery. And the way this question was asked, as you can see these pictures across the bottom, there's a woman pushing kind of a pebble, and then it gets bigger and bigger up a hill. And so we say, these pictures show a woman doing a task with kind of an increasing level of difficulty. And we only ask this question at end line and say, can you point to the picture that kind of reflects the level of effort associated with cooking before you had the Mimimoto, and then also point to the picture after having the Mimimoto. And so we can kind of see where is the shift. So we see that the light blue shows there's more people kind of reporting higher levels of difficulty and drudgery at baseline, and at end line, they're almost all at this very lower level of difficulty. This is one of the areas where we saw the most kind of extreme impacts. This is cooking health and safety. So among intervention households, there was on average an 83% decrease in experience of various health issues among both the participants themselves and, as they reported, among other household members. And so here, this graph reflects the intervention respondents reporting of experiencing these health issues at baseline and then again at end line. And we see these just, very drastic decreases among the various issues. Here we wanted to look at kind of changes related to fuel procurement, time, money, and distance. We see that the amount of money spent on fuel greatly increases. This isn't surprising because they're now purchasing pellets, and they may, they weren't doing that before. So the amount of money spent goes from 367 to 705. The distance traveled actually increases slightly from 1.46 kilometers to 1.53. From the focus group discussions and just kind of asking customers, this was actually because the camps are huge. And so even though the customers were no longer going outside of the camp to collect fuel wood, now some of them had to travel to a specific distribution point to get those pellets. So they still had to travel a bit. The time associated with fuel procurement dropped a little bit, but not as much as we would have expected. And kind of through the focus groups and follow-up interviews, we found that this was really because of that seasonality shift. So among the comparison households, there was a big increase in the amount of time associated with fuel procurement from baseline to end line. And this was because, as I said, the baseline was during the dry season and the end line during rainy. And so it's a lot harder to find that dry wood, or, you might have to travel further to purchase charcoal. So the fact that the time remained kind of relatively similar in the intervention households tells us that Inyenyeri kind of enabled these households to balance out the difference that would have naturally occurred with this change in season. This graph shows changes associated with the level of drudgery with fuel procurement. So the other one was related to cooking, and this one is collection of fuel. And again, we see kind of the light blue baseline, more spread out across the different levels of difficulty, but at end line, people are reporting much more kind of the easy, low levels of drudgery. And one quote from one of the users here is, "We stay in the camp, so there's no risk of being beaten looking for fuel out of the camp." So not only less drudgerous, but she feels safer as well. This graph is related to status. So we wanted to know if the Inyenyeri users felt any change in status. And so 57% said that they felt about the same, but 43% said they felt more respected since having Inyenyeri. And the majority of those said this was because they thought that community members thought they were rich, and also some thought that they were smart. And this little quote, it's short, but I thought it kind of reflected this kind of status concept as well. Is one of the users said, the children always eat before sleeping. And so that's, a reflection of kind of economic stability and also status, just understanding that we have the ability to always feed our children. And that's a result of both kind of the money, the time, the ease, all of those things are captured in that really small quote. Here we look at kind of what the Inyenyeri users reported as the things that motivated them to participate with Inyenyeri in light blue, and then actual experienced benefits. What are the things they experience in dark blue? Oh, can you go back? Sorry. So we see things like speed of cooking and cleaner and reduced smoke as both motivators for participating and experience benefits. But something that's interesting is we see that larger percentages of respondents cited ease of cooking, versatility, and uses less charcoal as motivators, but not as experience benefits. So this might be something that Inyenyeri could look into, like versatility, for example, or ease of cooking. Why is it that less people are reporting that as an experienced benefit? Maybe is there some sort of training or additional support that could be provided so that people really experience those benefits as well? The final kind of customer satisfaction slide, here we asked what were kind of the main challenges that customers faced. And so 52% said nothing, which is great, and 48% said the cost of pellets. And then we can see, a few other reports of things like product damages easily, children can't use it, weak battery. But clearly cost, as Susie mentioned, they already knew this would be an issue, but this was the main thing reported. A quote was, as refugees, we prefer price than paying attention to consequences or time. So again, saying that price is really the most important thing. We saw this also reflected in the focus groups, that cost was reported as the main barrier that households face. And participants explained that they often buy kind of a packet of pellets at the beginning of the month. They use that, but then when it runs out, rather than buying additional pellets, they supplement with charcoal and other fuels, so that they really only were buying that one initial packet, which served as their subscription fee as well, kind of enabled them to keep the stove, but they didn't have enough money to keep purchasing to meet all of their household needs. And so even if we think back of that stove stacking graph, the very first one I presented, it's probably that they're using the Mimimoto all the time for each of those cooking tests until they run out of the pellets, and that's when those other stoves come into play. And so as Susie mentioned, and I think she'll even talk a little bit more, this is just a really strong finding that in order for the Inyenyeri to have all the impacts that we know it has the potential to have related to health and drudgery, enabling the users to use pellets to fulfill all of their cooking needs is what's needed to kind of get there. And finally, I just wanted to provide a few little snapshots from the focus group discussions, just to kind of help you see some of those alternative types of findings you can get with this type of data collection. Of course, what I presented thus far is more that quantitative survey, but here we did these focus group discussions with users, and one technique we used is having them draw a picture that represents life before having the Mimimoto, and then draw life after having the Mimimoto. and asking them, where is the cooking taking place, who's involved, what does the household look like, what else are people doing, and so these are just kind of snapshots of that. And some of the kind of interesting quotes was in the after picture, one group of participants drew people relaxing, enjoying a clean premises and life. Someone else said, smoke from my old cooking devices introduced quarrels with neighbors before, but now we have peace with them. So there's things related to kind of cleanliness that don't necessarily come out in the quantitative survey. And yeah, so I think that kind of concludes my findings. We'll pass it back to Susie to talk about how they've used that. But I think in general, it was just really interesting to kind of see some of these large impacts associated with Inyenyeri use. And as I mentioned, I'll stress that it was really important that we had that comparison group as well, because we were able to kind of identify what changes were because of Inyenyeri versus other external shifts.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that great presentation. We already have one or two questions in the question part of the dashboard, which we'll go into shortly. We are running a little bit behind, but we did want to just for a minute have Susie talk about how this evaluation kind of helped Inyenyeri move forward with the scale up of its project that is currently ongoing in Kigeme. So Susie.
Thanks. I will try to keep it brief, but honestly, it's a little bit difficult to do so just because the outcomes of the ICRW report were so valuable to us, and also it's just been really exciting to see how the input from that evaluation has also helped us design the scale up. But it was, first of all, very valuable to us to have ICRW's evaluation because it gave us an independent, non-biased data set, which frankly didn't contain a lot of surprises for us because we've already had a lot of customer feedback from our customers in Gisenyi who had also been using the Mimimoto and our fuel pellets for quite a long time. So we knew the issues around beans and ugali, and we're working on that together with Mimimoto to improve those things. But what we were pleasantly surprised by and what we had heard anecdotally but just didn't actually have any data on were the self-reported time savings, the ease of cooking, and the self-reported health benefits were really good. So we were very pleased with these results. And as Ali said as well at the end, is that obviously if we wanted to really achieve, or Inyenyeri very much has the potential to reach great impact, but in order for us to really reach that impact, we would have to increase the purchasing power of refugees. So the ICRW evaluation definitely confirmed what we had already gathered from our customers ourselves, and that is that they wanted to purchase more Inyenyeri fuel, but they just didn't have the cash to do so. And the perception of Inyenyeri being expensive, I just have to remind you, during the pilot, that was because they were receiving free firewood, and there was absolutely no financial incentive to purchase Inyenyeri. So they were using their food stipend to purchase cooking fuel. Next slide, please. So with the results from the ICRW evaluation, we really set our fundraising goal together with UNHCR to increase the purchasing power of refugees. So together, we fundraised from a various group of donors. The Belgian government decided to fund cash for clean cooking fuel to refugees in Kigeme. So that money is actually going to UNHCR to then be distributed to the refugees in order to increase their purchasing power for clean cooking fuels. Then together with IKEA Foundation and the Global Alliance, Inyenyeri is receiving all the funding for our operational scale up. So that includes the costs for all the Mimimoto stoves, our shop operations, etc. A large part of the funds, the funds were also very important in order to get the kitchen performance test done. So Berkeley Air Monitoring took a KPT inside Kigeme camp, which really set the bar or set the standard for how much the refugees would need to receive from UNHCR in order to be able to afford exclusive cooking with Inyenyeri. Next slide, please. So that's where we're at currently. Just in the past month, UNHCR has started giving Inyenyeri clients inside Kigeme camp enough cash according to their household size in order to purchase enough kilos of pellets to cook exclusively with Inyenyeri. However, these cash transfers are unconditional, which means that they could start using it for other purposes as well. So it's going to be a very interesting few months for us, where we are definitely going to be tracking all of our sales data just to see whether, handed with enough cash, do Inyenyeri customers purchase enough in order to cook exclusively with us. The objective of the project, because we know that the funding, in order to keep the refugees at that cash level for cooking fuel, might not always be there. What we want to prove with, as long as it lasts, is that if refugees are given enough cash to meet their needs for clean cooking fuel, what the impacts are. So we hope to see a reduction in, for example, visits to the health clinic for lower respiratory infections, sexual and gender-based violence, etc. So this is a very interesting time. We're also being researched by Johns Hopkins University about the effect of the uptake of clean cooking and partner and domestic violence. So that'll be interesting. But there are a lot of other aspects that are very interesting about this project, which I won't go into now, but would love to talk about more. Thank you, Kathleen.
Wonderful, thank you, Susie. I hope that gives an idea to everyone about sort of the scope of this project, which was a small project, but is, I think, leading to big things, we hope. And as Susie mentioned, the Alliance is working with Plan International and Johns Hopkins to assess their current scale-up model in Kigeme. So there will be further research on this going forward. So we are a little bit behind, but we're going to go into now the moderated Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, you can either type it into the chat, which is shown here on the screen, or you can go to the questions panel on your dashboard, and that way you'll be able to type in your question. We won't be able to do them verbally just because there's so many of you, and it tends to get a little disorganized on an audio basis. So. I'm going to start off with a question for Susie. Let me just pop these out here. So Susie, sorry, a question for Ali. For the social impact time measurements, did you do the time measurements yourselves, or a time noted using users' perceptions?
Sure. Yeah, I could go on and on. We actually piloted several different ways of measuring this. It was users' perceptions because we tried to design a survey that any company can go do with their users. We tried different methods of kind of time journals and all of this, and what we landed on is basically we have you come up with what are the five most common cooking tasks in your region, and then ask, okay, so how often do you make porridge? And each time you make porridge, how many times a week, what are the devices you use to make porridge? And then they list. And how many times per week do you cook porridge on each of those devices? And then each time you cook porridge on that device, how long does it take? And so that enables us to add up the average amount of time spent cooking porridge in a week across all cooking methods or cooking devices. And we wanted to do it that way because we recognize that even at the end line, they're not only using the Mimimoto, right? They're still using the other devices. And so you're getting the whole mix of kind of all the devices you use to do that task. How much time does it take? And then you kind of add it up and you say across these 5 tasks, this is how much time it was taking before and how much time it's taking now. That is self-reported. We know that's not, you know, the most ideal way to collect that data. There are misreports and biases, but trying to ask like in that very specific way and with a large enough sample gives you a good sense. And we've also seen in the research that people either tend to overestimate or underestimate, but they're consistent with their over or underestimation, so that when you are measuring kind of the change over time, it actually comes out pretty accurately.
Great, thank you, Ali. Susie, a question for you. This is sort of about Inyenyeri's subscription model. Why do you think that the customer will trade the benefit of purchasing fuel daily with the one-time cost of renting or buying the equipment in pellets? And have you thought of a pay-as-you-use model for this to further pass on some of the cost benefits to the consumer?
Thank you for this question. We are actually currently developing a pay-as-you-go model. As maybe I didn't explain it before, but so the stove remains our property, and because we didn't have a pay-as-you-go system, it was difficult for us to, you know, if we're giving out this asset, we obviously need a return on investment. And so we had to have a way to get people to purchase enough pellets in order to keep the stove. And that's why we've created these monthly packages. It's also kind of a proxy way for us to see that we know that people are purchasing enough. So I'm talking about Kigeme now, where the monthly packages are much higher, but then we know that people are at least buying enough per month in order to be cooking almost exclusively with Inyenyeri, so that we're reaching the impact that we need. But you're right, a pay-as-you-go system will be more preferable for the consumer, and so we are working on that.
Perfect, thank you, Susie. Another question for Ali. Was the baseline time period for the incidence of health effects, such as burns, the same as the time period for post-intervention? I think the answer to that is yes, correct?
Yes, yeah. So the end line was conducted about 3 months later than the baseline. We'd recommend longer, but because it was a pilot. So what we did knowing that we were going to have that 3-month gap, at the baseline we asked, you know, experience of these health issues in the last 3 months. And then at the follow-up, we also asked in the last 3 months. So exactly.
Yeah. I'll just add from the Alliance's perspectives that really we consider these indicators to be health-related and quality of life. Unfortunately, this project was too short to sort of determine long-term health impacts, but Inyenyeri and several research institutions are interested in doing sort of longer-term studies on whether or not the Mimimoto's sort of reduction of smoke could impact health in a more significant and way that can be measured. Susie, let's see. A lot of questions here related to Inyenyeri's operations, which I think we can follow up on afterwards. But there's one question that goes back to this issue of cooking beans and it taking a while. Patricia McCardle asks, have you considered pairing the Inyenyeri with an introduction of an inexpensive but durable solar cooker like the Haynes, which is currently being used in Oct-Dec refugee camp in Uganda?
No, we have not considered that yet, but that would be an interesting model to consider. Although I think that for this, so we've really been focusing on this project just as Inyenyeri, and as you saw from the timeline, there are so many stakeholders and partners already involved. Obviously, you know, it would be great to do that, but it just becomes more and more expensive the more you add on, but it is a good suggestion. Thank you.
And a follow-up question, this is related to the Mimimoto. Have you experienced any technical problems related to the batteries or power pack that runs the fan in the Mimimoto?
I haven't heard this specifically from inside the camp. No, so I don't know. I haven't heard anything from the camp, but I'm sure that if we do, you're welcome to contact Inyenyeri in Kigeme and find out.
Great. Okay. I think we have one more question for Ali before we sign off. Hold on. Okay. I think we'll actually come back to these. If you've asked a question that we haven't yet answered, we will get back to you if you leave your contact information. Just because we are running a little over time. But I wanted to close with the first question we got, which is any ideas why energy has been largely overlooked for so long by many organizations serving in humanitarian settings? This is literally $1 million question, and the answers are many and varied. But from our perspective, people have known about this issue for a long time, at least 20 years. I think it really just comes down to a question of capacity and expertise, which is currently missing in a lot of humanitarian organizations, and just a competing priorities. When we work with organizations who aren't yet including energy in their aid, it just tends to be that, well, this is another thing to fund and another thing to deliver. And so our journey is really a process of convincing people that energy is impacts everything that they already care about. It impacts health, it impacts food security, it impacts protection. So this is the Alliance and the Safe Working Group are moving forward with our efforts to mainstream this into humanitarian settings. And we definitely urge you to download the fact sheet that we've put in the handout section to see a little bit about the work that we do in that, as well as check out the report itself that Ali has talked about during this presentation, and the impact measurement system, which is a free and open tool for organizations, both NGOs and enterprises who are looking to monitor their activities. Thank you very much to Susie and Ali for dedicating their time to this today, as well as to this project. And thanks to Kavanaugh for setting this up for us. And we'll see you for the next Alliance webinar in about a month. Thank you and take care.